Hello, MCU fans. Today we're going to look at the question of how time travel works in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, this is a very topical topic because with the death of He Who Remains at the end of Loki Season 1, we're going to have Kang variants popping up all over the MCU. So, let's dive right in and see what we can learn about the rules for time travel. Now, I'll admit the reason I came up with doing this video is some comments that someone left on an earlier video, The State of Villainy, that were really helpful. Somebody said, hey, the Red Skull in Infinity War, that's not the same Red Skull as in Endgame. And I was a little confused by that comment at first because, sure, it's earlier in the timeline by 4 years, but it's the same Red Skull, right? Well, after a really good conversation, I realized the answer is yes, but mostly no. So, without getting ahead of myself, let's dive right into some of the rules of Endgame, but let's come back to this topic again, and I think you'll see what I realized thanks to these excellent comments somebody left. By the way, that's why I love the comments people leave on the videos. I learn a lot, and it helps me with future ideas. So, if we look at Endgame, Smart Hulk said, if you travel to the past, that past becomes your future, and your former present becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future. And that's, of course, why they then joked about the fact that, Back to the Future wouldn't work because you can't go in the past, make changes, and have it retroactively change your own future. It just doesn't work that way with quantum physics. So what Hulk was also saying, without saying it, is that when you go in the past, you're creating a branch. Because there's really no way you can guarantee that what you do in your own past does not affect your future, i.e. like in Back to the Future, unless you're in a completely separate branch. For example, maybe you see a rock on the ground and you pick it up and you move it 10 feet to the left. Well, if it turned out that somebody later would have tripped over that rock, and because they tripped on it, and only because they tripped on it, they then have an encounter with you, well, now they're not going to have that encounter because you moved the rock. My point is simply, it doesn't take a big change. It can be a minuscule change, something that seems to not even matter at all, but that could drastically change the future. So you have to be creating a branch the moment you go back in time. And of course, in Endgame, they weren't just moving rocks 10 feet to the left or the right. Oh man, they were creating some major league branches. Look at the fact that when War Machine knocks Star-Lord out, it's a really funny scene. But if you think it through, if this was in the main timeline and they weren't already in a branch at this point, then when Star-Lord woke up, the Power Stone would be gone. Korath would have already taken it. That would have changed the entire Guardians movie. So it wasn't the taking of the stone, which they ultimately did, which Nebula ultimately got the stone and gave it to War Machine. It wasn't taking the stone that created the branch. They were already in a branch well before that. Likewise, Captain America fighting Captain America. I think the 2012 Captain America is going to want to know why he got a beatdown from his future self, And more importantly, Captain America said the infamous Hail Hydra line to Hydra. Very funny. But of course, that would create a branch where they all think he works for Hydra. And then, of course, there's Loki. And Loki vanishing away with the Tesseract, we know that created a branch, which is, of course, Loki Season 1. But in reality, it was a branch off a branch. They were already in a branch because all this carnage had already been happening up to this point. So it's just very fascinating. In all of these cases, they absolutely must have created a branch the moment they went back in time. So back to this earlier question then, is the Endgame Red Skull the same one as the Infinity War Red Skull? Yes, in that he eventually becomes the one from 2018, the 2014 Red Skull. But the moment that Hawkeye and Black Widow and all the rest show up back in time, a branch is created. A branch off of the main timeline, yes, but a branch. So that's why I say yes, but mostly no. For most of the time, he is a variant Red Skull because they are in a branch. Fascinating. I guess I had just never thought of it this way, but I totally agree with the comments that were made on my video. And in fact, it's the only way this whole thing with Captain America and Peggy works. I know that the writers and the directors totally disagree with each other, but there is just no way he went back into the main timeline. He simply couldn't have hidden himself away all those years. Instead, he must have branched to a separate timeline after he returned all the stones. And in fact, it's kind of interesting to think that when he was returning the stones, he was returning them to branched timelines. He would have had to go from the main timeline into the branches they created, or otherwise he couldn't have returned the stones. Isn't that wild? So he wasn't returning them to the main timeline. He was returning them to the branches they created during Endgame. But of course, that raises the big question, how did he get back? How did he get back into the main timeline if he created a branched timeline? In fact, how did any of them get back? I mean, in all these cases, they clearly were creating branches. They clearly were not in their own timeline, yet somehow they managed to get back to the main timeline. Endgame doesn't really say, other than it implies that just somehow it works, right? That the time machine brings them back to their own present. Of all things, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 7, which came out after Endgame, really answers the question. And I do understand that, for a lot of folks, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. isn't canon anymore. Even the later seasons in particular really kind of move off in a different direction. I don't have the answer. I don't know. But I do know this. Even if they're not 616 canon, they're canon to the multiverse. They happened. So this explanation provided in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. still applies because it's part of the multiverse. So what did we learn? Well, Fitz, who you see there, in case you haven't watched Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., finds a helmet that allows him to solve a dilemma that they've created. They went back in time, and as he explains, you branched off. But we can travel through something called the quantum realm, so we can go in between timelines. Fascinating. So they didn't say that in Endgame, but they had to imply that. I mean, there had to be a way to get back from their branches to the main timeline, and for Steve Rogers to go back to the branches to fix them, and then ultimately for him to return from his branch timeline with Peggy into the main timeline. So clearly the quantum realm allows one to pass between timelines. Wild. It all makes sense, but, I don't know that Endgame necessarily laid it out that clearly. In fact, I would argue the reason that, and I'll take responsibility here, that I was confused, I don't know if others were, but I was certainly confused because of this discussion with Bruce and the Ancient One. In this discussion, the Ancient One explains the danger of her giving the time stone to Bruce. And she says, the Infinity Stones create what you experience as the flow of time. Remove one of the stones and that flow splits. Now this may benefit your reality, but my new one, not so much. In this new branched reality, without our chief weapon against the forces of darkness, our world would be overrun. So tell me, Doctor, can your science prevent that? Great explanation, explained branching, but I'll admit, in my mind, I went, oh, I get it. So the branch is created only when the time stone is removed. Not necessarily. As we've been saying, they must have been creating a branch well before this. In fact, the irony is the Ancient One is telling Bruce about branching while she is in a branch. Wrap your head around that. Now, because of the fact that the Ancient One doesn't really seem surprised Bruce is there, she either knew he was coming or gets how it worked. So she doesn't seem concerned that she's now in a branch. What concerns her is if a new branch was created by taking out the time stone, which makes sense because Bruce coming back and creating a branch by his very existence in his own timeline doesn't hurt anything. But him taking the stone leaves them defenseless. Wow, wild, huh? So yes, I wish the Ancient One would have explained it that way, but nonetheless, that has to be what's happening. They're already in a branch, and he would create a branch off a branch, kind of like Loki did that. They went back in time and created a branch, and then Loki branched off of that. So it got further confusing for me because Bruce then explained, no, we can erase it. Because once we're done with the stones, we can return each one to its own timeline at the moment it was taken. So chronologically, in that reality, it never left. So again, in my mind, I was thinking, oh, so returning the stones removes the branch. Yes, but not every branch. It removes the branch where he took the stone from her, but it doesn't remove the branch that was created simply by them going back in time. Wild, huh? So yes, they clipped the branch without the stones in it, but no, they didn't clip the original branches. So it does leave the question, like, what happened to those? Does it even matter? In fact, let's look at some more branching and how crazy it can get. Absolutely love No Way Home. Fantastic movie. One of the best Marvel movies out there. But oh my goodness, did they ever create a bunch of branch timelines at the end of that movie? So let's think this through. Let's take just Tobey Maguire Spider-Man's timeline. The spell that was cast pulled the villains and Tobey Maguire from 4 different points in his timeline. Now, I'm using the years the movies came out just for simplicity, but keep this in mind. Green Goblin was pulled from the 2002, the first Spider-Man movie. Dr. Octopus was pulled from 2004, the second one. Sandman from 2007, the third one. And then Tobey Maguire from some point, probably the same time as No Way Home, 2024. But regardless, some point later in the timeline. So the spell pulled them from 4 different points. Then when the spell returned them, it returned them in a different state. So therefore, when the Green Goblin was returned back to 2002, it created a branch where he's now reformed. Now, whether then Dr. Octopus ended up even becoming Dr. Octopus, or whether he was then further killed, whether Sandman became Sandman, I guess it depends on whether Norman Osborn living changed that. It very well could have happened, but the point is there's a branch where Green Goblin is reformed, is cured. Then there's a branch where Dr. Octopus was returned to 2004. Now, in that case, Green Goblin's already dead. However, Dr. Octopus, being reformed, is now presumably going to save his life, but Sandman may still be created. Then Sandman was returned to a timeline where Green Goblin was already dead, Dr. Octopus was already dead, and now he's no longer the Sandman, but he's human. And then Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire, was returned presumably to his original timeline, which I'll touch on that a bit more in a second, but for the minute, let's assume that the spell works similar to the quantum realm, that he can be returned to his original timeline. Well, even so, Green Goblin's dead, Dr. Octopus is dead, and Sandman's still the Sandman. He has a memory of curing them, but of course that was in an alternate timeline that branched when they went back. So, wow. And then another possibility, of course, is that the very fact that things changed for Spider-Man, for Tobey, means he went to a 2024 that branched. Now, there would still be a dead Green Goblin and dead Dr. Octopus and a Sandman that still has his sand powers, but it just wouldn't be the original one that he came from. So I'm not sure on that. They don't really give us any indication. I think it's cool if he goes back to his original timeline with the memories of what happened, to be honest, but who knows, right? But wow, lots of branches being created. So what happens to all these branches? Well, obviously we learned from Loki a lot of information. Miss Minutes gives us some information about Nexus events in the sacred timeline. And then, of course, He Who Remains at the end gives us even more information. But I'll be honest, I still was a little hazy on everything. So I've pulled a quote from Michael Waldron, who was the head writer on Loki. Brilliant guy, just brilliant. This was really helpful. Let's look at this quote. So first he says, and that's just how time works. There's always like different permutations and instances happening. The TVA has their own barometer, their own gauge of what constitutes a deviation from the baseline, the way it's supposed to go, the way it went that produced He Who Remains. That is their baseline. He goes on to say, if you zoomed in on the timeline, it wouldn't necessarily look like a straight line. It might look like almost the intertwined strands of a rope fluctuating and spiking here and there. When it becomes a problem for the TVA is when, according to their own rules, when could something branch off in a way that it could actually produce a new timeline that could produce a new version of He Who Remains. That is the practical thing they're guarding against. Wow, so helpful. Let's break this down a little bit. First of all, when you think of the sacred timeline, I admit I thought of it as one timeline and one timeline only. What he's making the point here is, no, it can be intertwined strands of a rope, fluctuating and spiking here or there. So in other words, there can be more than one timeline. There just can't be any timelines that create nexus events. Those are the ones the TVA was pruning. So I kind of like to think of it as this is his way of saying, hey, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man timelines always existed. Sure, they could have been created the moment He Who Remains was killed. That's possible. But this idea of as long as they didn't create another He Who Remains, hey, they're fine. So there's multiple timelines, maybe even infinite timelines that can exist when the TVA was still around because they just didn't prune them unless they needed to. And so why did they prune them? What was the Nexus event? That was anything that would create a variant of He Who Remains, because he was trying to prevent the multiversal war. So basically, if you don't create another He Who Remains because of this deviation, you're fine. Go on, exist, I could care less. But the moment that you create a He Who Remains, that's when a Nexus event occurs, and they need to stop it before it goes red. Wow. Oh man, that makes so much sense. So much sense. So anyway, that's Nexus events and the sacred timeline. But we also learned from What If that timelines can happen without time travel. We've been talking about all these ways to create branched timelines, but as the Watcher explains, time, space, reality, it's more than a linear path. It's a prism of endless possibility where a single choice can branch out into infinite realities, creating alternate worlds from the ones you know. I'm the Watcher. I'm your guide through these vast new realities. Follow me and ponder the question, what if? So it's just important to realize you don't have to go back in time to create a branch. It is literally any decision that is significant enough can create another reality, and thus infinite realities. And as we discussed before, some of these at least may have existed even before He Who Remains was killed, because as long as they didn't create a Nexus event, no problem, you can exist. Which makes some sense to me, because I was trying to figure out, why was there even a Watcher prior to He Who Remains being killed? Because remember, the Watcher showed up in the Guardians movies. It just wouldn't make any sense. But this does make sense. You can have different realities as long as they don't create He Who Remains. And then, of course, once He Who Remains was killed, oh man, then it went nuts. So now you can have, that's why we're getting the Kang variants coming, because there's no longer anybody pruning those that prevent him. Wow. Again, it all makes sense. So let's now talk about incursions, because then the question came up, well, what if you go to somebody else's timeline? We've discussed a lot about going to your own past as well as your own branches that you created. But what if you go to somebody else's reality altogether, to somebody else's universe? Well, as Reed Richards explained, there's two ways that you can create an incursion. An incursion is when someone's presence in an alternate universe is that's not their own, confuses the universe and destabilizes reality. As a result, the more evidence they leave behind of their presence in an alternate universe, the more damage they will do. So that's why it was so important that they captured America and Doctor Strange when they showed up in the 838 universe. They wanted to contain them, to keep them from creating too much of a footprint. So it looked kind of mean, to be honest, that they threw them in those glass cages, but there was a reason for that. They wanted to keep them from causing an incursion by being, too much of a presence. So that's very interesting. So that's number one. And then the other way is that someone does not need to be physically present in the other universes to cause an incursion, as dreamwalking can likewise cause an incursion. So ironically, Doctor Strange broke both rules. He showed up in 838 as well as several other universes, but 838 for a long amount of time, and he later dreamwalked. So, wow. Oops. But what's also interesting about these rules is I just think Morbius at the end made a huge mistake. Sony, I should say, made a huge mistake. If you look at this first rule, someone's presence in an alternate universe that is not their own confuses the universe and destabilizes reality. I'm looking at you, Vulture. By Sony, number one, I believe changing the logic of the spell to begin with, because it should not have shot Vulture into Morbius's universe to begin with. But if you can even look past that for the second, he's going to create an incursion. The longer he's there, it should destabilize the Morbius universe and wipe it out. Now, the irony is that probably Disney knew this line was coming in Multiverse of Madness, because that came out not long before Morbius, or not long after Morbius, but because Sony just, I don't think even told Marvel they were going to grab Vulture and say, I want my toy and I'm going to pull it into my universe. Boom, then they end up, with this real problem. So I have no idea what's going to happen. I really hope they just say, oh, you know what, Vulture went back again. But hey, whatever. It just shows why everybody needs to be talking to each other, because clearly Sony wasn't working with Marvel on this one. But now, speaking of maybe not working with folks, how on earth did Miss Marvel impact her own timeline? At the end of episode 4 and during all of episode 5, we learn how the Bangle transports her back in time, and she ends up being the reason that young Nani is able to find the train and ultimately, get saved versus getting lost forever. And that's, of course, what led to Miss Marvel, being Miss Marvel. If she had not, therefore, simply said, if she had not gone in the past and been the one to make that trail of light, then maybe Miss Marvel wouldn't even exist, but certainly she wouldn't be the Miss Marvel she is today. So she did it. The bottom line is she did impact her own timeline. She went in the past and altered her future, which seems to completely break the rules of Endgame. Well, let's turn to the head writer and see how she explains it. There's a quote where she said, yes, we had the Avengers Endgame rules that you can't go back in like a consequential way. However, between Endgame and Miss Marvel, another little show came together called Loki, which I was very much a part of figuring out how time could work. And I would say that I think it wouldn't have caused a Nexus event because of the inevitability of it. So it was a closed loop. Interesting. So this isn't a situation where she went back in time, changed something, and it actually negatively affected her future. It's a case where she went back in time and did something that had to happen for her future. It was literally a closed loop. Interesting. So just accepting the fact that this is now a rule, then that must mean that a closed loop, traveling back in time to complete a closed loop is okay. That would very minimally, therefore, impact time travel because it's, probably not real often that happens. Still, I kind of feel like she wasn't necessarily talking to Marvel before she made this decision. Because if you look at the rest of her quote, she says, that's what's up. And it was also the fact that a Nexus event is caused by, well, you know what? I'm going to get shouted at by somebody, either by a fan or by Marvel. I can't tell which. But I will say this, that for me, it made perfect sense, and it fit into the logic that was established in the TVA, which seemed like the ultimate ruling on time, I think. She sounds less convinced, but still, I don't know whether she spoke with Feige or not. I hope she did, because that's a pretty big deal to have that in there. So I'm assuming she did, and maybe just was a little unsure she was explaining it right. I guess what I would throw in as another possibility, on top of it being a closed loop, is that the Bangle was magic. So we're not talking about time travel through the quantum realm. We're talking about time travel through magic. I guess you can make the rules up on that one then, because it's different. It's a different type of time travel. But I think the bottom line is just to focus on this was a closed loop. So it's a very isolated example that isn't going to happen very often, where you can go back in time and change your past. In fact, What If really made that clear. What If talked about the fact that there are absolute points in time in your past that you simply cannot change, even if it creates a branch. So, for example, Doctor Strange tried to prevent Christine Palmer's death. However, without Christine's demise, Strange doesn't become a sorcerer, doesn't defeat Dormammu, and doesn't gain access to the Time Stone to come back in time in the first place. Destroying the absolute point and altering his own timeline won't just create a branching path. Instead, it would lead to the destruction of his entire reality. Wow. Okay, so it's almost like the opposite of a closed loop, right? I mean, an absolute point in time is saying this thing that you're trying to go back and change, even in a branch, is so fundamental to your very existence that you can't change it. Because if you change it, then you really don't exist. So you have absolute points of time, which are almost the reverse of a closed loop. In the closed loop, you have to go back. If you don't go back, now you don't exist. Now your own future is destroyed. Very interesting. And if you remember in What If, it led to the destruction of his entire universe. So you wonder if Miss Marvel had not gone back in time, would that have led to the destruction of the main universe? Very interesting. So I do hope that Marvel is cautious going forward. I think both of these concepts, the closed loop and the absolute point in time, they both work. They can be explained. It's great. But Marvel just needs to be really careful going forward, I think, and just stick to these rules. And I do think they will. Feige has talked about really sitting down and nailing all this down. So I don't suspect we're going to have any issues going forward, but time travel is wonky, right? It's just wonky. So I guess we need to find out what else we have in store now that the Kang variants are coming. Only time will tell, right? We'll see. But again, I'm hopeful they've got all this straightened out and we're going to have some really, really good stories going forward. So like this video if you don't mind. Please leave comments. I love the comments. Again, they led to this very video. So please leave comments if you think I got something right, if you think I got something wrong. You can watch more videos if you'd like. You can subscribe if you're not subscribed. And together we can all watch as time unfolds with the ever-changing, ever-growing Marvel Cinematic Universe.